Hi there, my name is Bobby B. Croft, and today I will be talking to you about a topic that has interested me ever since we first began discussing it in class. The idea of comparing collectivistic versus individualistic cultures has always interested me, but for my Pecha Kucha, I wanted to take it one step further. I wanted to compare not only the beliefs and values of the two societies, but also how they handle conflict in different settings and what happens when these two different societies meet. Before we get to the differences in conflict styles, let's begin with a quick refresher on the differences between collectivistic and individualistic societies. We need to ask the question, does the individual's life belong to him, or does it belong to the group? Our book defines individualism as societies in which the ties between individuals are loose and everyone is expected to look after himself or herself and his or her immediate family. I tend to view individualism as the idea that the individual's life belongs to him and that he has an inalienable right to live it as he sees fit, to act on his own judgment, to keep and use the product of his effort, and to pursue the values of his choosing. Remind you of any nation in particular? That's right, you guessed it. The land of the free and the home of the brave comes in as the most individualistic country in the world, scoring a 91 on the individualistic score index, with Australia and Great Britain coming in at second and third, respectively. Now moving on to collectivism. Our book goes on to define collectivistic cultures as societies where the interest of the group prevails over the interest of the individual, which surprisingly is most of the world. Simply put, collectivism is the idea that the individual's life belongs not to him, but to the group or society in which he is merely a part of, and he must sacrifice his values and goals for the group's greater good. Any ideas on where the most collectivistic cultures are located? If you guessed Central America, you would be correct. Central American countries continue to come in as the most collectivistic societies in the world, with Guatemala leading the pack. One observation the author of our text makes is that nearly all wealthy countries score high on the individual index value scale, while nearly all poor countries score very low. Now that we have a basic idea of the differences between individualistic and collectivistic societies, let's turn our attention to the different conflict styles. But instead of focusing on the typical conflict chart that we've all seen probably 100 times, let's change it up. Ting Toomey refers to two different models for handling interpersonal conflict: the outcome-oriented model and the process-oriented model. Let's start with the outcome-oriented model. In individualistic cultures, the outcome-oriented model emphasizes the importance of asserting individual interests in the conflict situation and moving rapidly towards the phase of reaching tangible outcomes or goals. In a study conducted by Dr. Loom of UCLA, he compared American and Chinese conflict styles. Employing self-report data, he found that both cultures were more likely to pursue conflict with strangers than with friends, and the Chinese were more likely than Americans to sue a stranger, whereas Americans were more likely than the Chinese to sue a friend, which is sad but true. These findings support the idea that individualistic societies focus more on the results of the conflict rather than saving face and relationships. Now moving on to the process-oriented model. In collectivistic cultures, Ting Toomey says that the process-oriented model is the most common method of leaving conflict. This model emphasizes the importance of managing mutual or group face interests in the conflict process before discussing tangible outcomes or goals. Another study conducted by Dr. Lee and Dr. Rogan of UC Santa Barbara found that South Koreans, a very collectivistic culture, varied their use of non-confrontational strategies based on the status of the other person, using avoiding and obliging strategies more as the power of the other person increased. In the same study, they also showed respondents from the United States did not alter their use of avoiding based on the power of the other party. In other words, the Americans did not care as much about saving face, rather solving the problem by any means necessary. In summary, the results of these studies have led to the generalization that collectivists are more likely to be non-confrontational, whereas individualists are more likely to be confrontational. Oh yes, the conflict model that we have all grown to love. After going through several different journals looking for different models, I have come to the conclusion that the dual concern model is the best when comparing conflict in individual versus collective societies. This dual concern model predicts that when an individual has high concern for one's own interests combined with a low concern for others' interests, the most confrontational model is used, also known as dominating, most commonly used in individualistic cultures. If concern for one's own interests is low and concern for the other person's interests is high, the dual concern model predicts that the person will use an obliging conflict style, which is defined as non-confrontational style that emphasizes preserving the relationship with the other person rather than pursuing an outcome that only meets the individual's needs. Now hold on a second. All of the research presented thus far has been concerning solely individual or collective cultures and their conflict styles. So this got me thinking, what happens when a member of an individualistic culture has a conflict with a member of a collectivistic culture? Lucky for me, I have experience with this type of conflict in a recent trip that I took with my family. Back when I was in high school, my family and I took a mission trip to Guatemala City to build both a medical and dental office for an orphanage that would provide free health checkups and teeth cleanings for its residents. During this month-long trip, I had the opportunity to work alongside many Guatemalan residents from the area, but also had to deal with several conflicts that arose during the process. Now, before I move on to the next slide, I have to ask you guys to ignore my hairstyle. I'm not proud of it, and I'm not sure what I was thinking. It was high school, so don't judge me. Guatemala, being a Central American country, is considered to be one of the most collectivistic societies in the world, as we learned earlier in the presentation. This meant that these workers and I had very different ways of handling conflict, them using the obliging technique, and I using the dominating technique. This led to me making most of the decisions, which simply would not work for this type of project. We needed a variety of ideas and a variety of different ways to implement those ideas. After looking back on this experience now, I realized that we naturally adapted both of our conflict styles to make the process work. But this was much harder than it sounds. It was a give-and-take process where I had to encourage them to share their ideas and acknowledge the good ideas without hurting their feelings and preserving face. Without knowing it, both of us naturally moved from our traditional conflict styles to more of a compromising kind of conflict management style. During the course of this presentation, I have outlined the characteristics that define collective and individual societies, the common conflict management styles that they use, and given an example of what happens when these different styles clash in a work setting. My personal experience with the collectivistic culture has matured my conflict style in more ways than I could ever imagine. Hopefully, I have left you with a good idea of how these two very different societies manage conflict.